coming out. I'm Tom Wells. I'm a professor of history at this particular college. I'm honored to present Dr. James Finck, an associate professor of history at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma. Dr. Finck received a BA from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Wow. He then studied under James I. Robertson and William C. Davis at Virginia Tech while earning a master's degree. Finally, he received his Ph.D. at the University of Arkansas under the direction of Daniel Sutherland, during which time he corrupted our department chairman. Scott Darnavieski. And it took us 3 years to learn to pronounce Scott's name.
I still can't say that.
And by that time you're like, well, we'll keep him, I guess.
I can't say it
Office
myself.
is nearby. Students come looking for me out there. I tell them, they'll give them extra credit if they learn things. Okay, this is half the alphabet. For 5 years, Finck taught at the University of Texas Pan American before accepting his current position as American historian at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma in 2011. At a small liberal arts institution, Finck considers himself a generalist in history. Next to us. But his specialties are the early America and politics. Finck is the author of Divided Loyalties, Kentucky's Struggle for Armed Neutrality in the Civil War. Boston and Kentucky was fought for the South as for the North, am I correct?
Nope, more in the north.
War for the North. I have an ancestor from Kentucky who was an orphan, fought for the South.
Isn't that your older brother?
Yeah, I'm a younger brother.
I can never keep him straight.
Okay, as well as Images of America, Chickasaw. Finck is also the author of the nationally syndicated newspaper column, Historically Speaking, where he examines modern events through a historical lens. I give you Dr. James Finck.
Well, glad to be here. It's late. Surprised you guys were earlier talks. You indicate you're for your extra credit. So, before I say anything, I promised my school that I would mention something about my university really quickly. So I know for those of you that are graduating or looking for a 4-year institution, I teach at a school about 3 hours north of here. It's a highly selective liberal arts school. About 1,000 students, 800 to 1,000. Small classes. Most of my classes are about this size, and excellent education. And so, if you're interested in either that, or I can tell you stories about him too. So, I actually have there's a table set up on the far end out the hall down there that has some information about my school. So, if you're interested at all, we can talk afterwards. And like I said, it's a great little school. It's cheap too. So that's. I thought. Well, trust me, I have a senior in high school right now that we're looking at colleges, and so I'm very aware of finances and how much it costs to go to college. So, no idea how we're going to figure this out. So I understand where you guys are all coming from. It's a big deal. When I just call him Scott because I still can't say his last name correctly. When he asked me, at the time, I said this is still an interesting topic. And we were when he asked me right in the middle of the impeachment. And so I thought, what better topic to talk about than looking at the Andrew Johnson impeachment. So that's kind of what I want to talk about this afternoon, evening that we're here. So, when the Founding Fathers were putting together the Constitution, obviously, they had 2 principal concerns that they were looking at trying to accomplish. One is, how do we protect the people from this new government, right? They're scared of it. They just broke away from England. How are we going to protect the people from a new, strong federal government? But they also were concerned about how they were going to protect the government from the people, clearly, too. That was one of their big concerns. We were scared of a little bit too much democracy. So when it came to protecting the people from the government, they devised a series of checks and balances, which you're all probably very aware of. One of the principal checks on the power of government is impeachment. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution says, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. One of the keys in there, which again, we used to have to explain this more, hopefully unfortunately I should say, after our last impeachment, we don't kind of understand, right? It's conviction of. You have to be impeached and then convicted. That's the only good part about having an impeachment every so often is people understand what impeachment means. Fortunately, in history, the United States, we're not weighed down with an abundance of impeachable charges. Which going to take 79 years for our country to impeach its first president, and another 130 years before we impeach the one after that. Unfortunately, only 21 years from President Clinton until now. So obviously in 2019, President Donald Trump was impeached on 2 charges: abuse of power and obstruction of justice. Like most things in the Constitution, though, it is somewhat vague when it comes to impeachment. Most of the things in the Constitution are actually a little vague. Besides the part we just read, there are 2 other sections of the Constitution that deal with impeachment. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 reads, "The House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment." Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 and 7 read, "The Senate shall have sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, they shall be under oath or affirmation. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present." So, just as in, judgment in cases of impeachment shall not be extended further than to the removal of office and the disqualification to hold and enjoy an office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable to subject to indictment, trial, judgment, punishment according to the law. So that's what the Constitution says on impeachment. And if you're like me, that leaves me with a lot of questions of how impeachment should be, and how do we go about impeachment, especially when you watch the last one. There's a lot of chaos. And again, the Constitution is very short and very vague on this. So as with most constitutional issues, we've had to interpret it. We had to interpret exactly what the Constitution means. And the way that we do that is through laws, through the courts, oftentimes make these decisions, and also through precedent. And if you paid attention to the last impeachment, there was always talk about, well, this is how this was done before. So precedent is one of the few things that we have to try to interpret the Constitution with. And so when dealing with the first presidential impeachment, there was no precedent. And so Congress sort of had to make it up. They were the ones who were going to set this precedent. And so with the impeachment of President Trump, I think it's worthy to examine the trial and the first impeachment of President Johnson, just to see what we can learn from the Johnson impeachment, and to try to help us understand some of the things that we've had to deal with today. So first, to understand the impeachment of President Johnson, first we have to look at the 1864 presidential election. That's kind of where a little bit of this starts off. So in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln's elected, his VP at the time was a man named Hannibal Hamlin. And the 2 of them together only got about 38% of the vote. So Lincoln was not a very popular president. He does not have a mandate. More people voted against him than voted for him when it came to the popular vote. So he's not overly popular. And so when we start looking at 1864, it was never a lock that Abraham Lincoln was actually going to be the candidate. In a lot of ways, for us today, it's difficult because we think of Lincoln, and on most people's list, Lincoln makes top 5, if not number 1 as the best president. But that's not the case in 1864. Lincoln was not a very popular president when he was actually president. For several reasons. One, no president since Andrew Jackson had served 2 terms. So we had gone a long time. Jackson was the 6th president of the United States. We're now in the 16th president of the United States. We've had no 2-term presidents. It just wasn't done. People got tired of the presidents. So that's 28 years. On top of that, for the past 4 years, he's been waging a very bloody war that had cost the lives of thousands of people. Just think about some recent presidents we've had, and might have been popular, but wars hurt their popularity. This war was even bigger. When the convention was held, who was going to be the next president? Sherman had yet to take Atlanta. Grant was just starting to make his way around the Richmond area. And so there was still a lot of questions whether we were even going to win the war, whether the Union could win the war. So people thought, what's the point of fighting this war that we can't even win? On top of that, military efforts, people were complaining. It looked like Lincoln had kind of turned himself into a little dictator at times. And this is somewhat true. Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus. In other words, anyone that wrote a newspaper column that criticized Lincoln, he threw them in jail. And didn't try them. You're supposed to have that little part where you have to tell them what they're bringing them to trial. Lincoln suspends habeas corpus and throws dozens, if not hundreds of people into prison for criticizing the administration because he couldn't afford to have all this criticism. So he's done things like the Emancipation Proclamation. He did that on his own. He didn't go through Congress. And so a lot of people were looking at Lincoln. He's kind of a tyrant. We love him today, but at the time, you know, they really had to question whether he could win another election in 1864. And so when it became clear eventually, they realized that, all right, we're going to nominate Lincoln. We're going to stick with him. The debate in the convention becomes about the vice president. Who are we going to pick to be the VP? And if you ever pay attention to most VPs, they're usually there for one reason, to get votes. You pick someone who does something different than you do. If you're strong on foreign policy, maybe you get someone that's strong on the economy or from a different region than you're from, try to pick up votes. And that's the same back then. Vice presidents don't do very much. They're just there to get votes oftentimes. And so in this case, Lincoln wanted a Democrat actually to be, remember Lincoln's Republican. Lincoln is interested in a Democrat, a war Democrat, someone that actually supports the war. And he wanted one of them to be his vice president. He hoped that if he could find a Democrat who supported the war enough, that could enlarge his voter pool. Maybe he could pull, because the Democratic Party was very split at this point. There were peace Democrats that wanted to see the war over and just let the South go. And then there was war Democrats that were with the Republicans and wanted to finish the war. So he thought if he brought in a Democrat, a war Democrat, maybe some of those other Democrats on the fence would jump over and vote for the Republican Party. And that's kind of what he wants to go for. So there were several names, but ultimately Lincoln will side in the party on a man named Andrew Johnson. Now Johnson is a fascinating choice to be on the Republican ticket during the Civil War. He has the experience. He's in some ways a great candidate. He was a governor, he was a congressman, he was a senator, but all of those from the state of Tennessee, which was no longer part of the Union. So you're actually bringing in a vice president from a man whose country state wasn't even a member at the time. And not only that, but Johnson was a plantation owner and a slaveholder. Someone that seemed much more connected to be on a ticket in the Confederacy than on Lincoln's Republican ticket. So he's an odd choice. On the positive side, he's the only Southern senator that actually remained loyal to the Union. So even though his state left, he stayed on board. And so he does have Lincoln's ear. Lincoln talks to him because he's trying to figure out how to make the South come back, and he's an obvious person to talk to. As a Democrat, Johnson believes in slavery and states' rights, but he disagreed with secession. He thought that was wrong, and he also didn't feel that Lincoln's election in any ways was grounds. Again, it wasn't an illegal election. It was an unpopular choice. But so he didn't see secession as justified at all. Now we know, obviously, that Lincoln's going to win. If you didn't know that, surprise. Lincoln wins in 64. And as vice president, again, Johnson was there to get Lincoln elected. And you'll see this a lot. A lot of vice presidents have very little duty when it comes to what they do. So Johnson had no real responsibilities, and in fact isn't even in D.C. most of the time. He will visit with other people. Lincoln really doesn't need to use him. He was clearly not brought in to become president of the United States. He was never going to be nominated. Back then, very few vice presidents were ever nominated. Usually more secretary of states and other positions. He was never brought in to be a successor of Lincoln. He just happened to be in Washington when Lincoln's elected. He was there celebrating the fall of Richmond, having some parties, and so when Lincoln is shot, he's going to be sworn in as the next president, leaving the fate of our nation, now falls to, slaveholding Southern Democrat Johnson to figure out what to do with the war. Now, what we call Reconstruction, which is the process of how are we going to bring Southern states back into the Union. That process actually begun way before Lincoln died. He started talking about his plans for Reconstruction as far back as 1863. His goal was always the same for the Union as for Reconstruction. He just wanted to re-establish the Union. He wanted to do it with as little pain as possible. Lincoln wanted to be very open and friendly to the Confederate States. He basically talked about allowing states to have full citizenship again if 10% of the voting public would take an oath of allegiance to the Union. Only 10%. Again, this was meant to be easy. He wanted to allow the existing governments to remain in place. He basically was hoping that the Southern morale wasn't going to be hurt in any way. If they're happy, this is going to make Reconstruction easier. And so he was, again, his idea was, hey, once the war is over, we're all countrymen again, let's just come back together and kind of work this out. The problem is a lot of members of his party who were in the legislature, we call them today the radical Republicans, right? You've probably heard the term. They very much disagree with Lincoln. They want to see some serious changes in the South. They want to fight. They wanted all new governments to be brought in. They wanted to see a lot more freedoms from the freedmen population, the ex-slaves. They thought they deserved more rights. And they wanted to see as high as 50% oath of allegiance to come back in. Their attitude was more or less, we just fought a war. 700,000 people just died of a war. If we just let them come back in and kind of say do-over, that's a whole lot of people that died for what? If we're just going to go back to kind of the way it was beforehand, which was kind of the way it seems that Lincoln wanted to go. The Southerners, or the radicals, they don't care about Southern morale. They wanted punishment. They wanted these people lost. They started the war, in their opinion. They lost. They deserve to be punished, not sort of coddled on the way back in. So even before the end of the war, Lincoln has put forth his plan for Reconstruction. What he's calling for is a few things. He wants basically a general pardon for all Confederates. Obviously, everyone who fought in the Confederacy officially committed treason. Could have lined them up and shot them. But again, that's not going to work very well. Some people wanted, the leaders, Robert E. Lee, people shot, but if you go try to shoot Robert E. Lee, we'd still be fighting the war today, possibly. So Lincoln wanted to make this very easy. General pardon, basically, except for a few top-level people, which would have to sort of put in an application in order to be pardoned, one by one. Again, he thought the states should come back in completely. 10% of the population needed to swear an oath of allegiance. And part of it is the southern states did have to agree that slavery is over. That's part of it. They fought this war. So to him, the Union's back together, that's the goal. And let's make sure that slavery is off the table. And so that was his basic plan. He was going to make it as easy as possible. That's why it's sometimes seen as a little awkward that he's assassinated by a Southerner who's trying to get defend the South in a way, because they're actually, by killing Lincoln, is going to make it much harder on them than what Lincoln would have done. So Lincoln would have been easy. Probably, we don't know. Lincoln was also a very good politician. And if the country, he could read the room. And we don't know this, obviously, but he could read the room. And if he felt that the nation as a whole wanted it a little bit harder, he might have gone a little bit harder. But from what we could see, that his plan was, it was meant to be easy, right? It is second inaugural, right? Let them up softly, right? Let's basically, if you ever read that speech, let's be good to them. And so Congress, when he presents his plan, not happy. Right? Again, they want to punish the South. And they also were a little upset that Lincoln's even in charge. Again, this is a weird thing for us today to understand, but in the 19th century, presidents had little power. Congress was in charge. Congress made all the decisions. Congress, all the things that we yell and scream about today that presidents do, Congress used to do all of that. Lincoln, we had presidents like Andrew Jackson and Lincoln and different that could sort of bully Congress around a little bit, but Congress was ready to take back the power. The war is coming to an end. They wanted to make the big decisions afterwards. And so the South is not happy with anything. And so in 1864, the Congress is going to pass what is known as the Wade-Davis Act. This is their plan. They're basically challenging Lincoln. We don't like what you want to do. Let's challenge it. So again, this will sound familiar. They want 50%. 50% of the population must swear an oath of allegiance. They also wanted to see safeguards for the freedmen to have some civil rights. We can't just allow the South to take care of their own freed population, because they're not going to, obviously. Interesting enough, though, in the Wade-Davis Act, there's not voting. Voting isn't one of the rights that they're asking for the slave population. It'll come later. But when this bill comes to Lincoln's desk, he pocket vetoes it, right? He just sits on it. He doesn't do anything until it dies. And this was a situation when he dies. So he hasn't done anything to the bill. He's vetoing it by not signing it, but it hasn't been killed off. And so during this chaos and this fight, we get Johnson, who all of a sudden is thrown into, probably next to Harry Truman, is one of the most difficult first days in office of, hey, there's a war, what are you going to do? Truman had to figure out, do I want to drop an atomic bomb? Johnson has to figure out some pretty big issues as well. And in the beginning, the radicals were quite happy with Johnson. They thought, hey, this is someone that we can work with. Johnson had always had a lot of bad things to say about the planters. He didn't like the planters. He was a poor kid who made it rich while he lived in the South. He didn't like the rich planters. And so he was saying a lot of the right things. And everyone thought, yeah, Johnson's going to come down and crush them. Yet, to their surprise, he turns out to be even more lenient than Lincoln in what he wants to do to allow the South to come back in. Like Lincoln, he just wanted to get it over with. Let's just let them back in. His idea was, right, secession was illegal, so they never seceded. If they didn't secede, why do we need to bring them back? And so he's even more lenient than Lincoln. Again, sort of everyone's a little bit surprised by this. He ends up pardoning a lot more leaders than Lincoln did. Anyone who appealed, he gave him a pardon. He does nothing to help the free population. Again, slaveholder himself. And he starts giving all the land back. What a lot of people try to do is take land from the planters and give it to the slaves. The 40 acres and a mule idea. Johnson said, no, takes all the land, gives it back to the farmers, and says, it's theirs, so you can't take it. He waits for Congress to take a recess, which they do quite often, and while they're on recess, he basically orders all the southern states to submit new constitutions, except the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, and before Congress came back, he basically approved all of these states and said, you're all back in. Getting different than when Congress was away, they were away, right? And so Johnson waits for them to go away and says, well, they're gone. I'm just going to do this myself. You're all back in. Just got to accept the one thing. So obviously, when Congress comes back, this is December of '65, they're going to try to challenge the president. They're not too happy with this. And so they're going to start passing some bills to get through Congress that are going to try to make some changes. One such was the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a lot of things to help the ex-slaves. But Johnson vetoes it. Basically, he says it's up to states to protect their own people, not the federal government, which is, again, fairly common at the time. But, what he's asking is Alabama should take care of their own blacks, which, of course, Alabama in 1865 was not going to do that, and he knew that. And so, with this resistance, Congress starts looking for reasons to impeach. So basically, the radicals, they didn't have a reason to impeach yet. They needed to find one. They just want to get rid of him, and that's the way to do it. They were strong enough in Congress that they're going to be able to join with some of the moderates of the Republicans, and they're going to get a few laws passed, some amendments passed, most importantly, right? The 14th and the 15th Amendment, citizenship rights to anyone born here, voting rights to the free populations. And these amendments will ultimately be ratified in the United States, but all over Johnson's veto. Congress was strong enough to override the veto of Johnson. So they're going to get bigger, they're going to get stronger. Now, these amendments, the South isn't going to take very well, right? They're not happy with these, and they're going to react. We're going to see violence because of these amendments. We're going to see violence from the KKK, as they're going to be, intimidating blacks from voting. We're going to see a lot of just southern cities and areas, a lot of protesting and a lot of violence is going to start to happen. And Johnson will do nothing. Why the violence starts, so the war is over, but we're still seeing a lot of, we're seeing death again. And Johnson will sit back and do nothing. What he will finally do is go on a national speaking tour. And while he's out there, he basically takes the opportunity to blame all the violence on the Republican Congress, on the radicals. It's their fault that we're having attacks. It's their fault because they're trying to, disrupt what the condition is in the South. And all this is going to do for Johnson is take away any goodwill he might have ever possibly had. Johnson had been working up to this point with the more middle-of-the-road Republicans, the more moderates. But after his little national tour of blaming Republicans for everything, the moderates in Congress want nothing to do with him. So if anything, he's driving them over further to the radicals. His refusal to do anything to help the black population in the South is going to lose him support of not only the Republicans in Congress, but a lot of people in the North by this point. They think that they see the violence, they see the death, the destruction. The president should do something, and yet he doesn't. And so he's already lost support from Democrats because he left their party and joined Lincoln's, and now he's lost all support from the Republicans, and so he's kind of in a pretty difficult situation. He really is a man who doesn't have a party in any way. And lastly, again, he loses just the people in general. His speaking tour really kind of turned people off. And so one of the outcomes is in the 1866 midterm election, so we're electing congressman and senator, is going to be a huge win for the radical element of the Republican Party. So in 1866, they're just getting stronger and stronger and stronger in Congress, and Johnson's just getting weaker. So now, when the next session starts, Republicans, the radicals even, are in firm control of Congress. They're dominating it. And now they have enough where they can really override anything that Johnson wants to try to veto. So again, they're going to take advantage of that. And they're going to set to try to take back sort of control away from the president. And so we call this time period Congressional Reconstruction, where we have Presidential Reconstruction, and then when Congress takes over, it becomes Congressional Reconstruction. And what they're going to do, because they can pass laws, again, Johnson can't stop them, is they're going to bring down the hammer. Right? We're going to punish the South. Most notably, there's a lot of things. The big one is they're going to create 5 military districts in the South. And they're going to put a Union general over each one of those districts. They're going to declare martial law, so that basically the entire government will be under the control of these generals. So basically what they've done is stripped away the power of all the government officials in the South. And there's a general now that'll make all the decisions in these areas. Pretty big deal. And again, Johnson vetoes all these. Doesn't matter. Congress could override them. Then finally, they think they're strong enough that they're going to move against Johnson himself. So with their numbers, they're going to pass 2 new bills, and these are where we're going to start seeing with the impeachment. Both of these were meant to limit Johnson's powers, but they also knew that Johnson wasn't going to accept these new bills, and hopefully, what they're hoping, their goal is that they can trip him up. So they're passing laws that they hope that Johnson's going to break. The first is called the Command and Army Act. And what this does is it takes away Johnson's authority as commander-in-chief. With this new law, he could not give orders to his troops, which again, he's commander-in-chief. But in order to pass any kind of orders, it had to go through the commanding general, who happened to be Grant, who happens to be with the Radical Republicans in a lot of ways. So in other words, they make Grant commander-in-chief, basically. Strip away his power. They were worried that Johnson, because he's in charge of the army, even though they passed the bill of the military, that Johnson in charge of, could just pull the military out. And which he might have. And so now he can't. He can't tell his own troops what to do, because he has to have permission from the commanding general. So that one's bad. The second one is one that's going to get him in trouble. Both of these were meant to get him in trouble. The second one is called the Tenure in Office Act. And what that did is it basically says that the Senate must give approval to pass any cabinet officer, right? If the president appoints officers in the cabinet, the Senate has to approve them. So if the Senate approves them, the Senate should have the ability to have permission to fire them also. So they're saying that Johnson is not allowed to fire any member of his own cabinet. Again, that's going to get him in trouble. What the radicals fear is that this is Lincoln's cabinet, right? These are all Republicans. Some of them are the radicals. Their fear was that Johnson would start removing these cabinet members and replacing them with Democrats, which he probably would have at some point. They were probably right. And so this was one of the areas they're trying to protect themselves, but they also are doing something that they know will not be acceptable to Johnson, and it shouldn't be. But the plan worked. For some time, Johnson had been fighting with the Secretary of War, a guy by the name of Edwin Stanton. Johnson doesn't agree with the troops in the South. The war is over, the South is back in, we shouldn't be an invading, occupying army. So he's been ordering the Secretary of War to remove the troops. Stanton has basically refused to do so. And so not only that, but Stanton has been openly critical of Johnson. He's been fighting with Johnson, doing everything he can to sort of undermine Johnson. So, as you would expect a president to do, right? We know our current president loves to fire cabinet members. Maybe justified, maybe not. This one's fairly justified, right? Stanton has done everything in his power to make Johnson look bad. So finally, Johnson gets fed up, and he fired him. And he replaced him with Grant. And he thought everyone would be, acceptable, because Grant's, the biggest hero in our country. Again, this was all done while Congress was on recess. Congress comes back. They're obviously furious. Grant will resign, because he's sort of in cahoots with them in a way. So he resigns, leaving an opening, and Congress on their own will reappoint Edwin Stanton to be Secretary of War. So he's fired him, but Congress has said, well, we're not accepting that. We've rehired him. and he's now going to be in charge, even though the president didn't nominate him. Johnson, he's not going to have this. He does not believe that this is going to stand up in court, in the Supreme Court. He's going to take this to trial. He's like, this is not in the Constitution. This is not going to stand up to office. And so he fires Stanton again and reappoints him again just with a guy by the name of Lorenzo Thomas. And he says, hey, I'm taking this to the court, but in the meantime, this is what I'm going to do. And here's the thing, Johnson's right. This will not stand up at the Supreme Court. Once the Supreme Court sees this case, they throw it out and say, this is unconstitutional, you can't do it. The problem is things are going to happen before the court has time to take up this case. So they are going to eventually throw it out, but not before Johnson is going to get in trouble, because he did exactly what the law says he's not allowed to do. So the thing about this case is Johnson does it. No one's questioning whether he broke the law or not. He did. He's questioning whether that law was legal. But before it got a chance, he did it. So in February 24th, 1968, if you want to date, the Congress is going to vote to have 11 articles of impeachment. And they're going to vote 126 to 47 on these 11 articles. I'm not going to read all 11 articles to you. They basically, very repetitive. They just say the same thing in 11 different ways. It's kind of amazing. It boils down to basically that Johnson broke his oath of office by firing Stanton and hiring Thomas without consent of Congress. Right? Because Senate does have to confirm any appointees to those positions, and he doesn't do it. So he's broken his oath of office. And again, they basically say it in several different ways. One says that they violated Stanton's rights, and one says that he was conspiring with Thomas against Stanton. So a lot of different ways of saying you shouldn't do what you do. My favorite is the 10th one. Congress says that he criticized Congress with a loud voice, certain ineptitude, inflammatory and scandalous language. Basically what they said is Johnson's a meanie. And so we're going to impeach him because he called us bad names, which he did plenty of. The Senate will then hear this, right? We know that, right? Congress impeaches, Senate tries it, right? The Senate becomes the jurors, you bring in the Chief Justice, and again, hopefully you've kind of paid a little bit of attention to this last one. This one will take about 3 months. Sorry, man. Texas is killing me. I realize allergies in Oklahoma are bad, and they're always telling us our allergies are coming from, they're blowing up from Texas. And being in Texas, oh my gosh. Actually, I lived here for 5 years, but I've been gone for 8, and I've lost my ability to be in Texas because my throat is like dying. Thaddeus Stevens, by the way, they bring in 2 House managers to run, just like we saw in the last election. Both of them are radical Republicans, the most famous being Thaddeus Stevens, if you're familiar with him. And this was supposed to be easy, just slam dunk. They have the numbers and then some to convict him. The Republicans want him out, they have the numbers. Yet, when the voting is actually done on impeachment, they're going to be short by 1 vote. So they had him, they could have had him. By the way, not this last one, these 2 impeachments that we've seen in the past with Clinton and with Johnson, both times the party doing the impeaching has the numbers, and both times they don't impeach. So it's kind of interesting. This last one, they didn't have the numbers, so it wasn't ever going to happen. The defense team was made up of 5 very well-known lawyers. One was the Attorney General of the United States, who resigned to defend Johnson. And their defense was really easy. Johnson hadn't broken any laws. Again, very similar to what we just went through. He didn't do it. They said that the Tenure of Office Act, for one, did not apply to Johnson. They said that he never appointed Stanton. Lincoln did. So he had the right to fire him. And secondly, their law was unconstitutional, which it will be, but not when he did it. And that's the catch, right? So their argument is basically, we know they're wrong. Right? Again, should sound fairly familiar. Johnson, they claimed that the whole reason he fired Stanton was to challenge the law. Because in order to put that law to Congress, you had to have a challenge. And so by firing Stanton, he was challenging the law. He knew the Supreme Court would eventually overturn the case. Again, the problem was not in time. And so they argue that Johnson does not met, a high crime. What he did was not a high crime. This is not an impeachable offense. That's his whole trial. And some other things of why he gets off. The moment the trial starts, Johnson reaches out to the moderates, the Republican moderates, basically and tells them, hey, sorry we're not getting along right now, but can we make up? And he tells them, hey, I won't interfere with Reconstruction anymore. If if you guys keep me in, I won't mess with everything. And so in a lot of ways, and even promises, he'll appoint this really famous or popular guy amongst the Republicans, his name's Schofield. And so he's reaching out, you know, trying to settle everybody down a little bit, and it works. Even more, the House managers in the trial are going to really have a hard time making a good case. Because, you know, during the trial, it's revealed that the whole reason for these laws was to trip him up. It's sort of, you know, very similar to, like, basically from the moment he came into office, they said, we're going to impeach you. They fill out the paperwork, they just leave the part blank of what he did. And they were just looking for a reason, and they actually made the reason. And so that's kind of hard in a trial when they're trying to prove it. And that all comes out in the trial. The whole reason was to trip him up. And there were other considerations too. One of the problems was if Johnson was removed, there's no vice president, by the way. That all comes later. So he's president without a vice president because they have to wait for the next election. Nowadays it's different. But then there wasn't. So the next guy in line was what's called the Senate pro temp, a guy by the name of Wade Johnson. And everyone hated him. They actually hated him more than Johnson. He was kind of friends with the Republicans, with the radicals. He was a Republican, but he was always known as difficult to work with. And he had some really radical stuff. And this is perfect for the 20th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. He thought women should vote. And that was one of his things that he was pushing. And even the radical Republicans were like, that's insanity, right? We can't have something like that happening. And so they really want Johnson gone, but then they start kind of reconsidering, well, if we get rid of him, we get this guy. And this guy's a lot worse than the guy that they're trying to get rid of. The other issue with Wade is everyone knows who they want to be the next president. It's Grant, right? Grant's coming in. And the idea is if we bring Wade in, who's like one of us, we're going to have a hard time kicking him out in a couple of years and bringing in Grant. It's hard to kick out sitting presidents. It's only been done like 5 times, but it's not easy. So Johnson will be easy to kick out. Wade's not. So once the trial started, some of them actually started reconsidering it. Maybe, you know, Johnson's making some promises to us, and you know, maybe he's not so bad. And so when it really came down to it, a lot of the Republicans, especially the moderates, just realized they didn't want to remove the president for this reason. It was a power struggle. You know, and they thought this is a precedent I just didn't really want to create. The precedent that if we don't like the president, that we get rid of them. And that's, you know, not what they wanted to do. They thought this would really hurt balance of power. And so when they had reassurances from Johnson, enough of the Republicans were happy enough he wasn't going to be president for long. The next election was coming. Their idea was we could just replace him maybe more legally than just getting rid of someone we don't like. And so in the end, there's actually 7 Republicans that are going to vote to acquit him. And a lot of historians believe there's more. The more would have if they needed to. But they didn't need to, so they didn't. Because it's going to hurt some of the, right? Mitt Romney, right? Mitt Romney in Utah right now is like mud. I think he'll be okay down the road, but and I'm convinced that Romney wouldn't have voted that way if that would have been the deciding vote. But a lot of the Republicans were like, we would have voted, we didn't need to, so we didn't. But there was a lot there. One of these Republicans said afterwards, to the quote, "I cannot agree to destroy the relationship, the working of the Constitution for the sake of getting rid of an unacceptable president." So they recognize that. We're gonna hurt the Constitution, we're gonna hurt balance of power, just because we don't like him. Maybe not be the best reason. One last note, the guy who gets credited with being the final vote, a guy by the name of Edmund Ross, he was the last one that is going to basically be that final vote that acquits him. There is a lot of rumors at the time that haven't gone away yet that maybe he was also bribed. So there's always that possibility too, that Johnson supporters were bribing him enough to, you know, the vote to acquit Johnson. So in the end, everything works out in a way. Sort of everyone's happy. Johnson's a lame duck after this. After this, right? I mean, he has no power. He has no party. So there's no one that's going to work with him. And so he doesn't interfere. He just, you know, basically isn't even a president. Grant will easily win the next election and go on to work with the Congress, and they will keep Reconstruction going strong until 1877, basically. So the radicals get everything they want. Johnson kind of goes away. Senator Ross loses his seat in the next election because he voted the other way. He will switch parties and then get elected as a Democrat after this because the Democrats were like, good for you. That's the one thing I think, here I can editorialize. I love all the Democrats that are calling Romney a hero right? He was a hero, he stood up for himself. I just wonder if a Democrat had voted their conscience and had acquitted, if they'd be calling that person a hero, right? You're always a hero when you agree with us, so kind of the same thing here. Democrats were good for you, and they're going to bring him in. So yeah, he wins a Senate seat in 1874, serves for 3 months and then dies. So what is interesting about the impeachment that we just went through is some people have seen a lot of similarities between what we saw with Trump and others don't see any at all. And again, it really comes down to how you want to look at it. Supporters of Trump will see two presidents who basically disagreed with a hostile Congress who just wanted him removed for political reasons. Others say there's no similarities at all, and they see something more like the Nixon scandal, where they see a president who clearly overstepped his authority and then tried to cover it up. And that's what gets Nixon more than anything. And they see the similarities with that with possibly Johnson. The problem is this split that we're talking about, those that see a similarity and those that don't, is usually on party lines. All right, Republicans see it one way, Democrats see it another way, which is, just like the Johnson impeachment or every impeachment, we see basically on party lines. The difference is with Johnson, Republicans had to cross the party line to clear him, whereas with Trump, they would have had to cross the party line in huge numbers in order to convict. But either way, the vast majority of the Senate in all three impeachment hearings that we've had, Johnson, Clinton, and with Trump, what we've seen is voting almost completely down party lines. So in a lot of ways, what do we learn from this? From Johnson and from studying all these impeachments, one of the main things we can learn is that impeachments are political above everything else. It's one thing to always remember. Impeachments are political trials. They're not criminal trials. And I think that's one of the things that we learned. And that's it. That's some time for I'll try to keep talking if we have any questions.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So the Republicans...
Fixed person in the back.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a plant. As far as the Republicans who acquitted Johnson, did any of them do it because they kind of respected him having been in the Senate and staying in the Senate? And even
nothing that I've ever really seen, because he'd been a Democrat. And guys, one of the things I think, we were talking about this earlier, another great historian in the back is, politics has been politics forever. Democrats, they're always fought. So he has been a Democrat. The 1850s is one of those decades that is kind of similar to what we are today. People always, one of the questions I get asked when I give talks places, are we worse off today politically? Are we less friendly? Are we fighting more? And the answer is no. It's bad right now, and it is bad, and it's ugly, and politicians are horrible people. But the 1850 politicians, it's the same way. I mean, they're leading us to civil war, and so there's not a lot of love between them in a lot of ways. From what it seems like most of them is they just really recognize that what they did. We created the trap, you fell in it, now we're going to punish you for it. And a lot of them just recognize, there's better ways to do this. If he had maybe 4 years to go, maybe more of them would have voted to get rid of him, but he's really on the end of his term, and so it's not going to be very hard just to vote him out, and that's the better way. So that's what I've been able to find. It's not a lot of respect so much as let's do the right thing. So everyone's like, we're tired and hungry, we want to go home, and if we ask questions, he's going to keep talking. Well, okay.
So did he broke the oath of office whenever he fired him?
Yeah, he did it.
Right, did he do it just to challenge him?
That's what their defense is going to say.
Okay.
I think he hated the guy and was mad at him, and all along never believed that was a real law. Whether he was specifically said, I'm going to challenge that, that's what the defense team's saying. My guess is really he never thought it would hold up in court, and so he never thought he'd be impeached on, because if you think of that is
It
inconstitutional.
doesn't sound right, yeah.
You can fire your own cabinet officials, and so he just never thought it was going to turn into anything. And it shouldn't have, and it shouldn't have ever even been passed to begin with. So whether he specifically thought, even though the defense, he knew he was going to make it through the courts. It just didn't go fast enough for him. Yeah. So, but yeah, that's what's interesting about that trial is no one questions whether he did it or not. Like you could look at, do this as much PC as I can. Like you can look at the Clinton trial or the Trump trial. And obviously, Republicans are saying, right there, but even if you're going to convict, you still had to connect at least one dot. And I'm not saying that dot's not there, right? I'm not trying to, you guys, that's up to you. You had to at least connect a dot in order to say, yes, Trump did. With Johnson, There's no doubt. He did it. He'd admit that he did it. I fired the man. He's claiming that it was wrong. I would even argue with Clinton more or less. Did he lie under oath? Yes. And there's really not a lot of doubt. He's kind of pulling the same kind of trial, saying, hey, so it's just interesting. In at least two of the cases, Clinton came in. I had inappropriate relations with that woman, and I said I did it under oath. And so it's interesting again that we have. Both times you have the numbers in the first two impeachments. You have the numbers to convict. You can't question whether they did it or not. The question really comes down to both times, is it a big enough deal that we think we should remove a sitting president? Like if Nixon had gone all the way, we probably would have. But at least in those two, the party who had the numbers decided no. And again, this last one they might have if they had the numbers. Actually, probably, but in the end, it wasn't going to happen. The Republicans had the control of the Senate. But I just always found that interesting. And that's why I sometimes even say when I talk about Nixon, and I say that Nixon would have been impeached, and I always say probably would have been convicted. I think probably, and the other historians from here, but I never say absolutely, because again, this is political. And his was maybe bad enough that the Republicans would have, but until you do it, politics is involved, and until you final it out, and I never say he would have been, I say he probably would have been, because when it comes to politics is crazy, and the other people that we know did it for sure, and they weren't convicted, so maybe if Nixon was after Trump, or after Clinton, and saw that maybe he wouldn't have resigned and fought it, and who knows what would have happened, so, because, again, it's like they all did it, but they were all getting off too, so, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like,
no, definitely.
It's interesting to look at the president. So
follow up on that, then the 0 for 3 then on removing a president. So do you think the system works, the checks and balances?
Yeah, I think so, because again, I think on all these cases, especially the Johnson, he never should have been impeached. The other ones, it's difficult with the other ones because if you take Clinton, he did it, in a way, but was that enough? Is that a big enough thing to remove a president? And so I think it's working okay. I think Democrats today would say no, because I think they would have convicted. There's a lot of hatred there. But yeah, again, I guess I'm glad to see we're not removing presidents because of a lot of politics. And I don't want to get too much in here, but my guess is, this is just me, if you were to interview, look at transcripts from every single president in the last 50, 60 years, they're all doing the same thing he did. Not that makes it okay. So don't misunderstand me, but they're all, it's just, I think that's politics. I think people were watching him and were looking and got him on something that probably is done all the time. So maybe we should fix that, So that's just what I think, is I think people just wanted him gone and they were looking, similar to Johnson, they were just looking for the thing to get. They'd already filled out the paperwork. They just needed the headline of what are we going to put as the charge, because we're just looking for a reason to impeach. So again, I think if they had the numbers, they would have impeached or got rid of him. So he was impeached, obviously. All right. Well, thanks for coming.